everyone. Yes, as you'll have just seen, the meeting is being recorded. So we sort of want to come together this morning to gather some sort of youth views on the Glover Review, and also, well, mainly the government's response to the Glover Review, because of the Yorkshire Dales now needing to respond to the government's response of the Glover Review. So just a little bit of background information on the Glover Review. I'm not sure how much you know about it, but it was a report which involved Julian Glover and 5 others who went to all the English national parks and areas of outstanding natural beauty and some other unprotected landscapes. So they reviewed all these protected landscapes and made a load of wide-ranging proposals in response to going to these areas. So it was published in 2019, and then the government has responded to the Glover Review just recently in January. So hence why we're having this meeting. So yeah, so our purpose is, like I said, to collate a youth response as part of the Yorkshire Dales National Park's wider response to the government's response. So we'll sort of go through the meeting and try and make it quite informal, and just sort of, yeah, just if you've got any questions, just unmute and ask them. I mean, there's also a link in the chat to Slido where you can answer anonymously if you'd like, and we'll have a look at that. So for me, my name's Joe. I'm one of the youth representatives on the management plan steering group. I live in Malham. I'm currently down in Birmingham studying economics at uni. I'm in my 3rd year. So yeah, and I'll hand over to Laura to do an introduction for her.
Yeah, thank you, Joe. Can you all hear me? Yeah, excellent. I've got my headphones on, that's all. Yeah, so hi everyone, my name is Laura Day. I am the other youth rep on the management plan steering group alongside Joe. I am born and raised up in the Westmoreland Dales. I live in a little village called Orton, so up in the north of the park. And I'm a final year PhD student at Durham University, and I work on Cumbrian landscapes within literature. So yeah, as Joe said, we're just going to go through everything really informally and just ask some questions. But yeah, if you'd rather respond anonymously, that's completely fine as well. So I think that's it from me. I don't know, does everybody else want to maybe introduce yourselves and kind of what area of the national park you work in? Because obviously Joe and I haven't got to meet many, if any of you really so far. So it'd be nice to hear from everybody what part of the park you work in particularly. Katie, I think you're on mute.
Second time today. So I'll kickstart. So I'm Katie, and I'm the Tourism Support Officer for the Yorkshire Dales National Park, and I'm also sort of the chair as such of the Youth Forum group, of which we have a few attendants here today. I'll pass over Caroline. I don't know if you want to do anything.
Hi everyone. Yeah, Peter, Kat, Jacob, Rebecca, I've never met you in person, so good to see some of you. Peter, I can see you. I'm the Youth Volunteer Officer at the Yorkshire Dales National Park, part of Generation Green, and I run all of our volunteering sessions and also run the Upskill Downdale volunteer programme for young people aged 18 to 30. So work quite a lot with Joe and Laura in their positions as youth reps. So yeah, I'm just sitting here today to kind of see what's going on. Won't input much, but yeah, it'd be nice to meet everyone else. Peter, I'll pass to you because I can see you.
Thank you. So I'm Peter. I've got 2 jobs. So one of them is in the planning team. The other one is building conservation. So for planning, I work mostly in the south and the west of the national park. And my patch for building conservation is the whole national park, but I'm based in Bainbridge, Yoredale.
Wonderful. Jacob, do you want to go next?
If not, I can.
Oh, mic isn't working. Yeah, Rebecca, please do.
So yeah, my name's Rebecca. I'm a part of the Historic Environment team, and I'm working with the Westmoreland Dales partnership. So I focus on the Westmoreland Dales, working with the Westmoreland Dales landscape partnership. I'm currently having some building work done today, so I am planning to be on mute for most of this. So yeah, we had some damage from the storms, so we're just getting some of that fixed.
I think there's only me left. So I'm Kat, I'm a woodland project officer in the trees and woodland team. Been in the role since December, and yeah, just here today to discuss the report. Feel like there's a lot of things to go through, and I'm interested to hear what everyone else thinks as well.
Yeah, and I suppose I should have also mentioned, if you've got any questions, you just type them in the chat as well, especially if people's mics aren't working. So yeah, I mean, going forward, there's three sort of broad areas of the report. So there's nature and climate, landscapes for everyone, and finally living in landscapes. So we'll sort of discuss each individually. So planning to sort of say what the original recommendations were, and then what the government have responded to that, to those recommendations, and then go on to sort of ask some questions about the government's response. So we start with the nature and climate area. So the Glover Review said that the state of nature and natural capital and national parks should be regularly and robustly assessed to inform the priorities for action. There should be strengthened management plans that should set out clear priorities and actions for nature recovery, particularly tree planting and peatland restoration. And the implementation of these plans should be backed by stronger status in law. National parks should form the backbone of nature recovery networks, and national parks should have a central place in the newly emerging post-Brexit farming and land management schemes. And then going forward, the government's response to those recommendations, they said that the national parks should be heavily involved in the government's environmental objectives. However, the responsibility for producing and delivering these strategies rests with local authorities at the county level. And then the national parks' first statutory purpose should be amended to focus more on nature and climate. And that statutory purpose is to conserve and enhance the natural beauty and wildlife and cultural heritage of national parks. National monitoring systems should be put in place to assess and provide data on habitat, natural capital and ecosystems. And there should be consideration of whether national parks have special status, and that status should be reflected in the new farming and land management subsidy schemes. And finally, the ambitions for nature should be through greater use of private sector instead of public money, rather than the reliance on public money, and there's no additional funding for this work at the present time. So going on from these government responses to the Glover Review, the first question we were wondering your opinion on is, what other priorities should be reflected in the first statutory purpose of the national park, along with conserving and enhancing the natural beauty, wildlife and cultural heritages of the parks? It's quite an open question.
So I had quite a broad point, not very specific, but I thought I didn't have any issue with the change of the statutory purpose to be amended. I think that's great. But I feel like there needs to be some sort of clause for accountability for national parks themselves to be more environmentally conscious in their own practices. So not really directly related, but that was just a thought that I had.
In that accountability, do you feel it's through objectives each individual national park almost sets out for themselves?
Yeah, I think if there was some sort of objective alongside the statutory purposes for all the national parks to aim to improve or reach a certain target, to be more environmentally conscious in their practices. I know I think it's in the National Park Management Plan, and we've got goals and targets, but I think if there was a specific sort of statutory clause, that would be good.
Sort of going off of what Casey said, it's sort of a broad point that again might not be specifically related to the question, which is that it seems like it's all well and good for government at a national scale to be sort of imposing these targets and these ideas as to how national parks should be run, whilst at the same time saying that we should be focused more on private funding. But ultimately, national parks are part of wider governments, and we're at the mercy of, you know, as a local government, we're at the mercy of doing what the wider government wants us to do. So by sort of saying that there's more that the national parks should do, I find it a little bit sort of, what's the word? It seems to contradict itself in a way. So by saying, you know, we need to plant more trees, that's great. That's a really good target to have. But at the same time, they're imposing lots of restrictions about where you can and can't plant trees. So it doesn't seem to be a very joined up approach. And by putting that pressure back on the national parks, it just, you know, we seem to be getting differing guidelines and instructions from national government that we can't seem to achieve, because at the local scale, there's constraints in place that prevent us from doing that.
So it's almost quite a broad approach being adopted by the government, and there's a need for more localised and individualised objectives for each park to reflect their needs and problems.
Yeah, definitely. And if they want to give sort of national parks more autonomy, then that's great. But I don't feel like that's what this report was saying. I feel like it was saying that there needs to be a centralised body that should oversee what goes on in each part of the country, and it's impossible to have a joined up approach like that when we live in such a country with such varying landscapes.
Is there any more points on that little section?
I have a comment on the sort of the use of private sector to create income for the national parks. I don't know if you were going to go on to that.
That leads nicely into the next question. So reflecting, obviously national parks receiving public money, and what more do you think they could be doing with the public money for nature recovery? But obviously anything connected with the use of public money and private funds, it's an open question.
So obviously government said that there isn't really that money for national parks. There's no extra resources. So I think if we are going to be going down that sort of private sector route, I think we need to make sure we definitely vet the private sector businesses who provide financial support, making sure that they're environmentally friendly practices, and they shouldn't have any hidden or reverse agendas or motives that would be contrary to the aims of the national park. And I think there should be restrictions on the extent of the involvement of private sector companies. For example, we don't want sort of McDonald's springing up left, right and centre, or like advertising boards.
Speak for yourself, I'd love a McDonald's in Carnaby.
But I don't know what the benefits to the private sector businesses would be, but I think there needs to be restrictions on advertising of companies. You don't want to have big advertising hoarding spoiling the countryside. It needs to be sort of low key. And then my other point was that I think there does need to be more government money available if they're expecting us to do all this, which is what was part of the response, and David sort of said in his response as well. And then my other sort of suggestion was whether, if we are going to be getting more private sector funding, whether we could have sort of more specific fundraising roles in the national park, or whether these could be evolved from our current roles to sort of incorporate fundraising roles so that we're actually generating income within various departments, or whether we could look at volunteers actually trying to generate income by fundraising. That was just another point.
Just to echo what you said in your first point, Katie, yesterday I spoke to 3 of the Upskill Down Dale volunteers and consulted them about this, and one of their kind of biggest concerns about public money was that, private companies, is that if they are funding the Yorkshire Dales National Park more, so private companies are funding, they'll have more governance and therefore they might have more of a say on what happens. And there's concerns around like you said, Katie, what kind of influence, what kind of things they might want. Is it always going to be for the benefit of our climate, for our environment, when they'll have more say in things?
Yeah, I definitely share those concerns, and I think those that are likely to have more of a say are the ones who currently have a lot of money and power already in the Dales. So I think having an increase in private sector investment in the national parks, it would risk us losing the voice of a lot of the smaller businesses and smaller people. So big conglomerates, big sort of, you hear about certain farms and certain businesses which swallow up smaller ones in the area. They would probably have a much larger voice as a result of that, and they would have a lot more control over what happens in the national park, which I'm absolutely against.
Yeah, and it's worth saying that concern is also shared by local farmers and landowners in the area, because I did a few workshops the other week, and when we were talking about different initiatives that are available for landowners, primarily tree planting with all of the publicity that it's getting at the moment, landowners and farmers are really concerned that there's going to be a huge influx of people and organisations coming in and wanting to buy up their land or adjoining land, and that puts them at significant risk of losing their income and their livelihood. So it's a really, I think, contentious point for them to have put in, that there needs to be more of a reliance on private sector money because of all the things that we've just talked about. But also, it doesn't look great. It's not exactly a partnership that you'd want to be going into, especially if we're talking about sustainability. Giving all these areas of land or relying on private money just completely contradicts it.
Yeah.
I suppose on the topic of like tree planting, and obviously you have these big private companies coming in and buying land and planting a load of trees so they can say they're offsetting the carbon. Like, are you seeing many cases of that already happening within the park, or are there sort of restrictions on that happening?
I haven't seen it at the moment, but I have seen, I've sort of been in meetings where it's been discussed about larger organisations buying up areas of land, even like the Woodland Trust or the RSPB or Natural England, and doing it for sort of PR reasons. And then whether or not it's sort of been subject to the same constraints that smaller landowners have been party to, it's clear that there are being some adjustments made for certain organisations. And obviously this is in the case of like Natural England, who are, what we would consider to be quite a believable, trustworthy body, but landowners are seeing that and not being particularly happy about it. I've not been here for long enough to know if there is a similar thing happening with private organisations, but I mean, certainly just by listening to the news and hearing that somebody like Ed Sheeran has bought loads of land to plant trees, you sort of think, well, is he really going to be told, no, you have to wait 6 months for an EIA to go through while we talk to all these different organisations? It does make you wonder, if there's going to be a lot of sort of underhand moves going on in order to make sure that Ed Sheeran gets his woodland planted when he wants it to be planted, whereas, you know, Mr. Smith, who's got a hectare of woodland, has to wait for 2 years because of surveys and other planning restrictions. So, you know, the public are aware of that, we're aware of it, and it's just, yeah, I think it's just going to become more widespread as this sort of campaign continues.
And yeah, I suppose there's a general consensus that, yeah, you don't want private corporations coming in, but what is there any power to stop them from coming in? Well, besides actually selling the land, but I'm sure if, you know, if there's land then and they offer a high enough price, and yeah, money talks in a way. So yeah, is there any way to stop almost the national park using that sense of place and becoming overrun with private corporations, which obviously the consensus seems you don't want that to happen?
I mean, I can only speak from a tree planting point of view. There are sort of, you know, you have to do an environmental impact assessment that has to be approved by the Forestry Commission and the Woodland Trust and so on and so forth. But that's mostly environmental impact assessment you do have to do for an area of woodland over 0.5 hectare. But in terms of all the other checks, they're mostly to meet the conditions of funding. So if it's going to be privately funded, I don't really know how strict those checks have to be. I guess I don't know really. It would be at the mercy of the Forestry Commission doing the environmental impact assessment, but they do reject some plans. So it's not that it would be impossible, but you know, are they going to be given more power? Are they going to be given more staff and more money in order to make sure that doesn't happen? There's lots of new guidance that's come out at the moment, and it doesn't seem that they've had a huge influx of staff to deal with that added workload. So it's, yeah, I don't really know.
See, from a local person standpoint, like the area is very agricultural. So while it is obviously sustainability and tree planting is very important, like if it gets to the point where we're planting more trees on land that's arable, and then in 5 or 10 years time we're having to cut them all down again because we're not able to produce enough food to meet the needs, that kind of it backtracks, and it's a lot of a waste of money as well. So I don't know about potentially more getting sustainability in farming practices. Like if you read the news today, there were things about how we're going to potentially have food shortages, we're going to have fertilizer shortages, which means there could be a push to try and grow in potentially more crops and things in arable farming back in the UK. And while obviously parts of the Dales are not necessarily suited to that climatically, things like oats and things have been grown there historically, and you know, we're getting potentially more cattle on the land rather than sheep, again because changes in prices. So again, it's not just that the tree planting, it is having that overall sustainability of farming in general. And I think that's a really important, like encouraging, you know, having the funding available for farmers to make that change, because obviously subsidies and everything else are changing at the moment. So making sure that they are supported in, you know, what they want to do, but at the same time it's not a risk of their livelihood, and we have to, you know, smaller farms selling out to become big conglomerates, because they can't afford to keep up with the times or other things. And then, you know, you could have the knock-on impact of having so many more cattle rather than lots of smaller farms. So I think that's just something to be aware of. On that side is, you know, we are here with local communities, a lot of who have been here for generations, and we don't suddenly want them to have to leave. I know in places up in the Westmoreland, it's a big complaint for people is all the house prices, they're all second homes, they're all holiday lets. If the farmers go as well.
Yeah. And it's worth saying that this was sort of my first point, is that all this report putting all this pressure on national parks to do more for smaller landowners is, well, if the financial incentives aren't there for farmers, if they can't make a living, then we are going to lose all this stuff, regardless of, you know, what national parks do. If the government changes its tact to focus more on tree planting, then how on earth can we expect farmers to make a living? And it's really worrying. And yeah, I completely agree with what you're saying, Rebecca. We're going to lose that sort of historical management of land. And yeah, I just think that it's just quite disjointed, really.
No, thank you. Katie, I think I might have interrupted you a couple of times. Do you have something to say, or have we covered it?
No, I think covered it. It was just that with regards to the funding, it's not sort of completely ruling out the private sector sort of funding side of things, but I just think we need to tread very, very carefully with it. Whether we started going down that route and it helped to kickstart opportunities for the national parks to actually generate more income. I don't know, but yeah, it's just a concern. But yeah, thanks, Jo.
And then the final question is they sort of said there should be a stronger mission for nature recovery to conserve and enhance the natural environment. So should there be a strengthened purpose in this regard to protect more landscapes?
So would that be, Jo, just to clarify, is that the statutory purpose is to conserve and enhance the natural beauty, wildlife and cultural heritage of the national parks?
Yeah, sorry, yeah.
Yeah. And DEFRA, so the government have proposed that it should be amended to focus more on nature and climate. So just to double check, is the question to sort of broadly, do we agree that should be strengthened to focus more on nature and climate?
Yes, no, sorry, yeah.
Yeah, cool.
Short answer, yes.
And I think from the Upskill Downdale volunteers, Alice, Isla and Simon yesterday, their short answer also, yes.
I was slightly disappointed in both the Glover Review and the government's response in the lack of recognition for cultural heritage. So historic environment, building conservation, archaeology, and I mean, given the importance of cultural heritage to national parks, and the value that this adds to the national parks, I just felt that it was almost unmentioned, to be honest, in the review and the response that I've read. So while I fully support the other parts of the statutory purposes, I don't think it should be at the expense of cultural heritage.
Has anyone else got anything more to add on that section?
Don't think so. Just that I agree.
Yeah,
But obviously climate is at the top, if that makes sense. But I agree with everything Peter said.
Yeah, and I also support him on the cultural heritage front.
Right, so we can move on to the next section, which is the landscapes for everyone. So the original recommendations were there should be a stronger mission to connect all people within the national park and outside of the national park as well. There should be a night under the stars in the national park for every primary school child in the country to allow them to experience what the national park has to offer. There should be a longer term programme to try and increase the ethnic diversity of visitors. Landscapes should cater for and improve the nation's health and well-being. Volunteering should be expanded within the national park. There should be a national ranger service created to implement those that already exist within the national park. This should be the national park should be supported to become leaders in sustainable development, and there should be more emphasis on the wider national landscapes family to include national parks, areas of outstanding natural beauty and national trails. So in response, DEFRA have said they agreed there should be a stronger mission to connect all people in society with national parks. And they also agreed with the night under the stars. So I've just lost where I was. So they said they'll create a new national landscape partnership to improve coordination and develop strategic partnerships and collaborate across campaigns. There'll be a short-term programme which will be introduced to reward farmers and landowners for increasing access to the national park. The government committed to working across all areas to support health and wellbeing initiatives in the national park. And the second statutory purpose of national parks should be strengthened to include more emphasis on health and diversity. And that second statutory purpose is to promote the opportunities for the public understanding and enjoyment of special qualities within the national park. The government has said they'll produce a sustainable tourism plan and engage with representatives from the national park to help inform that plan. And finally, there's a greater range of enforcement powers are going to be made available to national parks to help manage recreational pressures, such as antisocial behaviour. So off that response, the first question was, are there any other priorities that should be reflected in a strengthened second statutory purpose?
Joe, is it worth just repeating this, the current statutory purpose again, just so that we've got it?
Yeah, so that is to promote the opportunities for the public understanding and enjoyment of special qualities within the national park.
I just wanted to sort of make a point on that, which is that the sort of promotion, I feel like, is the wrong word. I feel like if we're going to have greater access to national parks, which I'm 100% in favour of, and I definitely think that there's a huge problem with diversity and accessibility to open spaces, and especially national parks and AONBs. I think that the thing that sort of confused me is that focus on allowing children or encouraging children to have at least one night under a dark skies landscape. Whilst it's important, I think it's equally as important that we put more of a focus on our natural spaces. And if you are going out into natural spaces, not only what they can do for you, but what you can do for them. Because as we saw over lockdown, more and more people going out into these protected landscapes and these natural spaces is fantastic. But if we don't show people how valuable they are and how delicate they are, then it's going to have completely the opposite effect as to what the government and the Glover Review is putting out there as its intentions, which is that, you know, if you have open access land and people let their dogs off leads, or you don't stick to the footpath, then you're going to disrupt ground nesting birds, you're going to destroy flora. There needs to be a much greater focus in national curriculums and across all areas about our natural spaces and how important they are and how at risk they are. And I really can't stress enough how in favour I am of allowing people to go into open spaces. I think it's really, really important. But I also think it's important that we don't just sort of say that, you know, we've got this sustainable tourism, which might essentially just be greenwashing tourism to have more footfall and bring more money into these spaces, but without actually that knowledge and that education that is necessary to protect them. I just think that there is not enough emphasis on that in this report, and it makes me feel quite uneasy about that sort of approach, if that makes sense.
I suppose in a way that leads into another question that we had, which is, do you feel like national parks should have greater powers to manage the numbers of tourists? Obviously, there's been a massive increase in footfall among people visiting the parks. So like some sort of ways we've got written down that national parks could manage visitor numbers, issuing fixed penalty notices, make public space protection orders and issue traffic regulation orders to control the amount of traffic on the roads. So, I mean, do you support national parks having them powers, and as well with them sort of measures? Do you think they're a good idea, or is there any others that you think could help the national parks manage visitor numbers?
I thought the government response was fine, but I think we might have suggested it wasn't an area that we would get involved in as the Yorkshire Dales, but I personally wouldn't be against it. But then I guess I'm not in those roles where it would necessarily directly affect me. But I don't think it should be ruled out. And obviously it might work better for other national parks than for ourselves, but I think we need to look at other solutions still, not just necessarily go down the enforcement route. I think it needs to be broader than that. If not enforcement powers, alternatives need to be looked at, explored, trialled, but definitely not ignored.
The Upskill Downdale volunteers yesterday knew of a system that is currently in place in the New Forest National Park, where they have kind of a similar system already in place, but they felt like the concerns would be around they think that it actually is a really good idea, but also given that power to enforce those rules, I think requires a lot of training. They believed it requires a lot of training, and a lot of money would need to be put into making sure it's really thought out, that the roles are different from the rangers, that if there are going to be specific rules, those rules are publicised far and wide so that when visitors come, they're aware of these people in these specific roles and aware of the codes of conduct. Don't know if anyone else has any thoughts on it.
Yeah, I definitely agree. I think it's really important to sort of separate out those roles and to highlight that if enforcement is going to happen, then there needs to be either more staff or more money or both, and greater awareness, definitely.
Yeah, I know. Like, yeah, it's a delicate area because you start like almost putting people off with like fines and whatnot, then word gets around, and but also I'm not sure on that the answer myself, but like how much monitoring of visitor numbers are there in the national park, and like how is there a way you could almost monitor how, if not, is the way to monitor visitor numbers over time, to see how they're changing, like whether the national park is getting stressed in a way from the sheer numbers. I don't know, to almost not rule it out in the future if visitor numbers become too much.
I think I'm not an expert, but I think numbers are monitored. We've got volunteers who do a lot of counting. Actually, yesterday I met a couple of Dales volunteers who were up on Simon Seat counting numbers. So I think it is monitored and we do collate that information. Don't know if, Katie, do you know anything else?
We also conduct a STEAM report, and I don't know all the ins and outs of it, but that records sort of visitor numbers, income generated, that kind of stuff.
No, so there seems to be a consensus to not grant like the national park's power to enforce greater enforcement and sort of for visitors, but I don't know in a way if there was, is there certain areas that the national park should exercise the power in, like I don't know, like sort of areas like antisocial behaviour or ensuring like the environment, ensuring visitors aren't degrading the environment, I don't know, like not walking on footpaths.
I guess that comes under the education side of things, more than the enforcement side of things. So, Sorry.
Yeah, I think it's hard to. I completely agree with Katie. I think it's hard to sort of pinpoint areas that might need policing more or might need enforcement. But certainly just from a practical point of view, for me personally, I think parking on country roads or in areas where it isn't designated parking is where there needs to be some enforcement, because it gets so dangerous. I mean, not just in the Yorkshire Dales, but in the Lake District. You know, it's quite frightening if you go there at sort of peak season. Some of the places that you drive past or you walk past, it's just, yeah, I think parking is the main thing that there needs to be greater awareness of. But if there is going to be any enforcement, then I would say that that's probably, from a safety point of view, the most important. Sort of moving away from the whole like climate and environmental side of things, just practically, it is problematic.
Just picking up on the point of education, like what channels do you think you could go down with the education? Is it sort of, I suppose you almost don't want to put out loads and loads of signs everywhere, because it's not necessarily in keeping with the landscape, and you know, if they blow away, then they're sort of in litter and sort of end up on in fields and stuff. So I don't know, is there like social media quite a good way, or what other channels do you think you could use to educate visitors?
I'd say probably the best method is probably one-on-one with people, like going out to the sites and having those conversations with people. I know we've had sort of in the education team Go Wild events where they set up like a stand and talk about litter and that kind of thing. So I think just more of that really, and obviously getting those messages into schools as well.
I think that, Katie, as well, was really reflected in the volunteers' opinions. They said, although they were in favour of some enforcements, but done very specifically and carefully thought out, they did think that money put into training and education in the case of Go Wild and stuff, having those conversations, educating visitors about how to, you know, their experience in the space and things they need to be mindful of, was really important.
Yeah, and maybe connecting with, if there's any sort of tours that operate in the area or any holiday lets or things like that, having, you know, sort of speaking to any organisations like that and just making them aware, or providing them with any leaflets or flyers or whatever. You know, I know it's not perhaps necessarily the most environmentally friendly way of doing things, or maybe it won't be picked up as much as it could be, but I think certainly with tourists coming in, you're not going to be able to put in that educational necessity that you might be able to with local people. But if people are coming in from other areas, and there's just, when you go into your B&B, a little sign up about it, or, you know, it says when you book it about what's in the natural area, it could be helpful. But again, sort of like we've been saying, there needs to be a provision for that. There needs to be staff and training and money. So yeah, that's just my thoughts.
And then finally, the final question in this section, the Glover Review highlighted it connecting all parts of society with protected landscapes, and then the government said they agreed that they should improve opportunities and remove the barriers to people in society connecting with these protected landscapes. I suppose it's particularly pertinent currently with the importance of public health and improving well-being and health. So do you agree that do you agree the second this purpose of protected landscape should improve connections with the wider parts of society with protected landscapes?
And also to add those, and there be quite an increased focus on well-being. Also part of it.
Yeah. Basically.
One of the things, sorry, Joe, one of the things the Upskill Down Dales volunteers said is they think yes, definitely, but they think a wide range of communities need to be consulted on how that's going to happen. So they feel like lots of funding is needed to have lots of conversations with lots of people to work out how to best do it.
It's a good point.
Yeah, that's a really good point.
Yeah, I thought so. I don't know if Peter, Rebecca or Jacob have an opinion on that one.
Well, without going on a massive diatribe, I think the social and economic issues that are relevant here go a lot deeper than a little sort of sticking plaster that the Glover Review proposes. So I fully support any measure to improve the way that the national parks can be experienced by marginalized, underprivileged, underrepresented groups. But I think there's very, very deep subversive issues that contribute towards that. And I don't think that's really within the scope of this exercise to resolve.
Jacob's put a comment here. I don't know if you want to read that out, Caroline or Joe.
I'll leave it to Laura and Joe to read that out.
Yeah, so Jacob's highlighted social media being good for education, like such as TikTok and Instagram, which, yeah, I completely agree with. You can have a really wide ranging reach using those platforms. So that's, yeah, a good point. So I think we've covered everything for that section. So I'll hand over to Laura for the final section, which is living in landscapes part.
Yeah, thank you, Joe. So just bring up my piece of paper. Okay, so living in landscapes. So I'll introduce, like Joe has done, what the Glover report said about it, and then how the government responded. And then I've kind of got a few, I think 3 questions maybe that lead on from that. So what did Glover say about living in landscapes? That national park authorities should work alongside other bodies of people and businesses to develop vibrant communities. That a new national landscape housing association should be created to build affordable housing in the national parks. That there should be a new approach to coordinating public transport. And so the idea is that this will be piloted in the Lake District. And I think, Kat, you mentioned earlier about how many people drive into the Lake District and park dangerously. So perhaps that's a good idea. And how there should be sort of new and more sustainable ways of accessing our national parks. And then national parks should be given a 3rd statutory purpose alongside conservation and engagement and then enjoyment of the park, to give greater emphasis on socio-economic works, sort of more people-based ideas. So the government responded to this in 3 main ways. The government said that they do not accept that national parks should have that 3rd statutory purpose I just mentioned, because it'll take the emphasis away from the work that national parks are already doing and the small amount of money, which has been mentioned by a number of people today, that you currently have for conservation, recreation, engagement and understanding work on sort of a nature and climate basis. The government also agreed that they would support a pilot in the Lake District regarding transport and how guidance can be created and updated around local transport plans. And the government responded based on housing that the difficulties on housing are national issues, not rural issues, and therefore should be dealt with on a national scale. And no special provision should be given to national parks in order to have to do that. So based on that response from the government, I'm just bringing up my questions. I guess 3 kind of more broad questions, excuse me. Do you have sort of any opinions on transport more broadly within the national park? You know, if you give thought, if you have indeed been to the Lake District, as Kat has mentioned, I live on the border between the Yorkshire National Park and the Lake District, so I kind of understand what's been said. But you know, thinking about the issues the Lake District might have, and the Yorkshire Dales has, particularly around Malham, does anybody have anything to say on transport in the national park?
Just that it is a pretty big issue, and I agree with the response that they would support a pilot in the Lake District, and hopefully that would be expanded for other national parks to trial as well, providing it works. But yeah, I think it probably concerns most national parks. And yeah, I think it's a good idea to just trial this scheme. I don't know much about it, but yeah.
Yeah, I think more sort of specifically as well, as this pilot scheme, like what do you think would work well for the national park? Is it better bus services? Is it more access to parking, you know, bigger car parks, if that's something you'd like to see? Is it, what kind of things does this group think would actually benefit in terms of transport?
I think,
Oh, sorry, Peter.
oh, sorry, Katie. I think this is one of the major hindrances to, going back to the previous point, to underrepresented, underprivileged groups, poorer groups of people who might be, you know, they're in the city, they don't have cars. The public transport links to parts of the Dales are virtually non-existent, and it is a massive obstacle to overcome, and it's one of the main reasons why we don't have more representation of those groups in parts of the national park. We've got a lot of people who are privileged enough to have their own personal transport. You know, there's a big emphasis on charging points and on car parking, on all these things, but I don't think not enough is being done to improve public transport, and I think it's very, very important.
Okay, thank you.
I agree that they're all very closely linked, sort of, in terms of like the access and what Peter was saying about diversity and creating more opportunities for people to come to the park. But I think there needs to be more of a focus on public transport than anything else, especially with the climate issue at the back of our minds as well.
Thank you. Does anybody else have anything to say on transport?
Obviously, I know Peter mentioned the fact that you got the charging hubs, but again, with this potential move to electric cars, thinking how long it has taken places to get broadband that is usable. You know, most people have broadband, you know, for 10, 15 years now. I think places certainly in the Westmorland and Ravenston are really just getting reliable broadband and fast speed broadband in. You're then potentially going to have people that, you're not going to have charging points. So actually you're then going to have to run a car that isn't an electric car, which again is going to be potentially more costly in things like insurance and tax. So again, it's going to be that economic pressure, which is also going to then impact kind of diversity and inclusion. Because, if everyone is using electric cars and, there's no ports or not enough ports available for 20 years, then people still need to get around if public transport isn't sufficient. So again, I think longer term planning to try and overcome some of those potential barriers before they become barriers. So yeah.
Okay, thank you. Does anybody have any sort of final thoughts on transport before I ask the second question? No. Okay. So the government said in its response to the Glover report that difficulties around housing is a national issue as opposed to being a rural issue, and should therefore be dealt with not by the national parks but instead on the sort of a governmental level. And whether there shouldn't be necessarily any provisions within the national park budget or otherwise to deal with housing issues. So what are your thoughts more generally on this? Is it a national park issue? Is it something that we should just leave up to government? What do you think are the issues, that haven't exactly been specific with issues? So what do you think are the issues when it comes to housing?
I strongly disagree with what the government is saying.
100%. I've never been so infuriated.
It's frustrating, very frustrating. I think there are very specific issues affecting housing in rural areas, and particularly places like the Yorkshire Dales and other national parks that it just completely just feels like they're completely bypassed, ignored by what the government's saying here. I think without effective control over those specific problems that are affecting our housing stock, any sort of further drive for things like affordable housing, it's all doomed to fail if we're not given the power to better control what happens within our national park, the housing stock. It's just nonsense what the government is saying. I think it's absolute nonsense.
Yeah.
Mm.
So see, everyone was like ready to pounce then. Turned on the mic. I was just going to say, yeah, the housing difficulties are a national problem, but it's a particular problem in rural areas as well, including national parks, and it's caused by, which we've discussed before, and exacerbated by people buying second homes, for one thing, and even though I said it's a problem nationally and rurally, they're very different problems, rural areas and urban areas. So yeah, it's something that, yeah, I was not pleased to see.
Yeah, I mean, understandably, I think it was back in maybe last summer, Tim Farron, who's the MP for Westmoreland and Lonsdale here in Cumbria, stood up and in the House of Parliament and said that 80% of houses bought during 2020 in Cumbria, so that's the county of, not just the national park, the Lake District, that is, 80% were bought into the second home market or the holiday home market. So that's outpricing young people in particular. And I know a friend who, you know, was going for a house. They work out at Sellafield and they were looking at a house down in South Cumbria, and they phoned up and made an inquiry, and actually they weren't eligible to buy the house because the house has got a clause in it saying that you can only buy it if it's going to go into the Airbnb or holiday home market, because we don't want permanent residents in this property, which is something I'd never heard of. So, you know, maybe that's something you've come across in the Yorkshire Dales, but it's happening obviously just a few miles away in the lakes here, and it's outpricing my friend who works at Sellafield, born and raised in South Cumbria, but actually can't live here, or at least not buy here. So yeah, I don't know if you've come across similar issues and sort of have any sort of ideas to do with those as well. I don't know. As
a planner, I've had only one case that sticks out to me recently, well, in the last few years, where I was put in a position that I had to basically approve permission for a barn to be converted solely into holiday let use, and I pushed very, very hard for it to be a local occupancy, to have the flexibility to be a local occupancy house, and unfortunately the policy that we have at the moment is simply not yeah, I don't think it's effective. I don't think it works. I don't think it I'll just be blunt, you know, I've got to work with these policies. I've got to sort of take the national park side, but at the same time I just don't think it's working properly. Yeah, I mean, I don't think the Yorkshire Dales, but do correct me if I'm wrong, have the same issue to the extent that the Lake District does. You know, I live in the Dales, but I'm like 2.5 miles from the Lake District as well if you cross the M6 motorway. And you know, I've been walking in the Dales in the depths of winters, and the villages are alive. You know, there's lights on, there's people walking their dogs, there's farmers, etc. You go and walk in Hawkshead or Coniston in the depths of like November, December, and it's dead. Not even the shops open. So. We do have the same issues, but it's yeah, certainly there's quite a few settlements I can think of. I mean, go to a place like Starbotton in Wharfdale, it's a ghost town. Is it? Askrigg, I've been working on a conservation area appraisal recently for Askrigg, which involved a public consultation. I believe that over 50% of the houses in Askrigg now are second homes or holiday lets. Wow. And that's, you know, it's quite a major settlement for Wensleydale. It's more and more places you get the impression that it's that the sort of local soul is being sucked out of it. You know, there's a lot of very strong, very resilient communities, but it's sort of constant battle of attrition against those communities at the moment. Yeah, and it's perhaps a friend of mine put it quite well, is that communities who tend to be from here, live here, born and bred here, we're probably edging on the more working class side of things, and the people that are coming in are more middle class and therefore have more money just by economic rule, I suppose. So it's kind of,
it's not necessarily a class issue, but it's kind of that edging out of the more traditional people who now actually can't afford to live here because we've upscaled the the Yorkshire Dales, and indeed places like the Lake District, like Dartmoor, etc., as a place that's iconic and we want to go to and live in. So it's kind of outpriced the people who actually were here first, type thing. So yeah, I mean, sorry, does anybody have anything else they want to say on the housing issue?
Just from a personal perspective, because obviously I work in the Yorkshire Dales, but I haven't found anywhere. It's taken me 4 months to find somewhere to live, somewhere that is affordable, somewhere that is appropriate. And the only place that I've managed to find, which I'm moving into at the end of this month, I found out through a friend of somebody that lives in the area. And that's the only way that I've been able to find somewhere. All of the properties that are up for rent are extremely overpriced. So it's not just a buying issue, it's a renting issue. And there's absolutely no provision for people working in the area. I mean, for context, I'm living in Lancashire at the minute, and it takes me up to an hour and a half to drive one way to get to the office. And that's because I have, I'm lucky enough to live with my parents who live within that distance. But before that, I was living in Leeds, and that was completely unsustainable as well. And there's not enough houses, which isn't solved by just building more because people want to buy them. And obviously it takes a while to build houses. And it's just completely mind-boggling to me that we are allowing people to continue to buy second homes and not doing anything about it. I know that Wales have just introduced some new legislation that says if you have a second home in the area, you have to pay X amount of council tax. And it seems like such a simple solution to such a widespread and difficult problem. But like Peter was saying, if we don't do something about it to make it more accessible, then we're not going to have young people working in these organisations. We're not going to have a more diverse representation because it's just not physically possible to get close enough to do anything about it. And then we'll have issues with brain drain, we'll have issues with trying to find staff, as we already have done. And I think it's such a huge and diverse problem that the government's just gone, oh, well, it's the same everywhere. I mean, I don't know about you guys, but I don't know anyone who's got a second home in the middle of, like Leeds or Blackburn, like they do in national parks and rural areas. So yeah, I was like in the middle of having a crisis about my living arrangements, and I read that and I thought, right, well, now I have something to say.
Yeah, it's just another example of the government basically treating national parks as a playground for the privileged elite and forgetting, or not forgetting, but just completely navigating around the issue that is actually a living, working, breathing area that has struggling local communities. And as as Kat said, I've been in a very similar situation. I'm renting a place. It's impossible to find a rental property at the moment. I think there's not enough is really said for affordable and affordable rental properties in the national park. They're a majorly important stepping stone for young people moving into the area. There's a lot of emphasis on affordable housing, on local occupancy and all this stuff, but actually, yeah, just rental places. There's not enough suitable, affordable rental places.
I'd say it potentially goes even wider than that. So obviously, historically and to some extent still, living costs are lower in the north of England, so you get paid less than if you live somewhere with higher living costs. And unfortunately, I'd say that kind of a lot of the parks, you have the same living costs because of house prices and the fact that you can't just pop to the shop, you've got to drive. So you have got the higher living costs without the higher local wages reflecting that, whether that's for kind of, a national authority, local authority, or kind of wider areas. What sort of job opportunities do you have in the smaller villages without having to go outside the park? Are they going to pay higher if you're working for, your local village shop, which you've managed to keep open just about with a post office? Actually, how can you afford to keep doing that when you've got other people who can come in and buy it and convert it, and it a lot more? So I think there are kind of wider issues as well relating to the housing, that people aren't necessarily able to get the jobs that pay, you know, obviously we've seen a lot of people move up north into the countryside over lockdown when people are able to work from home. So they're able to keep the higher salaries, especially you've got younger people who generally aren't on that sort of wages. So if you wanted to have a younger community, then you're going to have that issue as well. And then obviously you've got childcare, nurseries, school provisions. Like I think I was in Kirby Stephen and Great Ashby School has something like 16 pupils in the entire school. How sustainable will that be for the long term? Obviously with the move to academies and things. So I think there are a lot more going into it as well as housing, but I think housing has a massive impact in getting the young people in to begin with. And again, the diverse communities, those from kind of less well-off backgrounds. So I think it is kind of a very vicious circle. But it's something, you know, we can't just take as a one thing. I think it is a mixture that all play into housing.
Yeah, thank you. And I think Jacob said something as well in the chat. I think the government made it less profitable for people to buy properties for buy to let. Maybe this has had an unforeseen adverse impact. Yeah, no, that's a great point as well, Jacob. And thank you, Rebecca, as well. Does anybody else have anything they would like to say?
I've just been viciously nodding throughout all of that.
Yeah, there seems to be quite an emotive response to the idea of housing in the national park. But yeah, it's true. I mean, I can't afford to live here. So once I finish this degree and my parents are like, go and get a job, that's me out of the national park. So yeah, I know it's difficult. Hard.
I currently commute from Bradford for a couple of days a week. So it's either I do one day in the Westmorlands and then one day in Yoredale. And then I've luckily got a very supportive manager, so I'm able to work from home.
You drive all the way to the Westmoreland Dales from Bradford?
Yeah.
That's huge. That is huge, Rebecca.
Well,
oh my goodness.
I'm on the right side, but yeah, you know, I've met other people in the office. I think it might even be Jacob who work in Leeds or who live in Leeds.
Yeah, we've had people living in York, two in our section recently who've lived in York and commuted up.
So
wow.
again,
Crazy.
Especially short-term contracts, it's not sustainable again to move because you'll be there for, you know, a year, 18 months, and then you've got nothing. So
yeah.
Can I just ask the question of when the government gave this response of, oh, it's a national issue, not a local one? Who did they speak to have that opinion? And you know, where did this come from? I just don't understand. You know, if we're all sitting here having the same experience and the same point of view, and we know people who are also experiencing that, then who is saying that it's not as much of a problem as we all say it is? Or is there no information on that?
No, it's a great question, Kat. I mean, I don't know the answer to that, but I can absolutely have conversations to find out where that came from and feedback.
Yeah, that'd be great. Thank you.
Yeah, I'm sorry. There's some things on here that I don't know the answer to, but I'll find out, get back to you.
No, that's great. I think that, you know, you can't know everything.
No.
Okay, so I think there's just one more point that I need to cover in this section. So yeah, it's just a sort of a more general question about everything we've chatted about today. So everything that Joe has talked about, everything that I've talked about, and indeed everything that you all have talked about as a group. So do you have sort of any more views on this sort of area of consultation that's living in landscapes, or indeed just more generally, is there any other points you just want to add to anything we've said today that maybe didn't necessarily fit with one of the questions, but you'd quite like to bring it up and to feed it back to us? We'd really love to hear it. So if there's anything, please do shout up.
Laura, can I just add before we do an overall question, is it worth asking about the local governance question?
Yeah.
I'm happy to. So just each national park has a number of paid staff and a number of unpaid appointed members. Most of these are from local and parish councils. Each national park has a smaller number of members selected by the Secretary of State. These members provide leadership, scrutiny and direction for the relevant park authority. So it would be great to know which of the following measures you guys would support to improve local governance. So improve training and materials, streamlined process for removing underperforming members, greater use of advisory panel, greater flexibility over the proportion of national, parish and local appointments, merit-based criteria for local authority appointments, reduced board size, Secretary of State appointed chair, or anything else you might, any other ideas or thoughts you have on that?
Not really, just welcome a move in that direction, as you know, anything will be an improvement from what it is now, I think. Yeah.
Some of the thoughts, some of the thoughts shared by the Upskill Down Dale volunteers was board members and those on the steering group should be elected in reference to their hands-on involvement in the park, and possibly a set turn that they're in for, so that every now and again there's fresh faces, so it doesn't become stagnant.
Yeah.
And also a way of reflecting on the wider community, so wider community representation, and also teams of the park. So quite the Upskill Down Dale volunteers actually named a few heads of teams who they thought would make really good members, but well, or at least the kind of wider knowledge they have about very specific issues would be greatly added. And they thought that there should always be an equality and diversity member on the board, and greater number of women, especially on the steering group, as I think Laura is the only woman currently, and also more women on the board.
Yeah, I think the equality diversity is the key point there that needs to be improved. So it looks like they're looking to try and tackle that anyway.
Yeah. Is anybody, sorry, Kat, I think you're about to speak.
Yeah, I was just going to say I've not been here for long enough to sort of know enough about how it all fits together and it all works, but certainly based on what Katie said and what you've said, Caroline, I would say that yeah, greater representation and diversity sounds pretty fitting.
Thank you. Does anybody have any sort of final thoughts on what Caroline asked? No, I mean, and more widely, was there sort of anything anybody wanted to say about anything we've chatted about today? Is there anything you kind of really wanted to say but didn't know where it fit into the conversation?
Sorry if I missed. Did we cover the third statutory purpose point or not? Sorry if I blanked out.
Yeah, I think did I mention it?
Yeah, it was just I agree with the the government's response to that, I think.
Yeah, not having a statutory purpose, the third one.
Yeah.
Yeah, did anybody have anything to say on that? Sorry, I didn't ask a question on that one, but did anybody, I think, I'll just read it out again if I can find it.
Yeah, I agree with the government's response as well.
Yeah, I can't find it again. I'm not sure where it's gone. Sorry, I have about 1,000 pieces of paper.
We do not accept that National Parks should have this third purpose. It will take the emphasis away from the work and the small amount of money they currently have for conservation, recreation, engagement and understanding work.
Yeah. Yeah, so did anybody, I guess we've got a resounding agree with that, but I mean, yeah, seeing nods from everybody as well. Yeah. No, great. Thank you. I don't know, Caroline, did you want to add anything?
No, yeah, I guess to just say if there's anything anyone wants to share anonymously, they can add it into the Slido that we put the link at the beginning of the chat. And also, this will be recorded, so Laura and Joe will go over it and kind of collate those opinions and send them through. Yeah, is there anything else you want to add, Katie?
No, not really. Just a massive thank you to everyone who's come along, and particularly to Laura and Joe for hosting the meeting. Done an amazing job considering, you know, the time given and that.